leveraging strategic partnerships, and preparing for the implementation of potential new privacy legislation. Second, addressing and advocating for privacy in this time of technological change, with a focus on artificial intelligence and generative AI, the proliferation of which brings both potential benefits and increased risks to privacy. And championing children's privacy rights to ensure that their unique privacy needs are met and that they can exercise their rights. Selon moi, ces priorités stratégiques sont...
I believe that these three priorities are where the OPC can have the greatest impact for Canadians, and that these are also where the greatest risks lie if the issues are not addressed. Protecting privacy is one of the paramount challenges of our time. My office is poised to meet this challenge through strong advocacy, collaboration, partnerships, education, promotion, enforcement, and capacity building, which includes doing more to identify and address privacy trends, and doing this in a timely way. Investigations under the Privacy Act, which covers the personal information handling practices of the federal government departments and agencies, and the PIPEDA Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, Canada's federal private sector privacy law, are a key aspect of the OPC's work on issues that significantly impact the lives of Canadians.
The results of my investigation into ALO, the operator of the website Pornhub and other pornographic websites. I found that the company had contravened Canada's federal private sector privacy law by enabling intimate images to be shared on its websites without the direct knowledge and consent of everyone who is depicted. In releasing my report on this investigation, I reiterated that the non-consensual sharing of intimate images is a serious privacy violation that can cause severe harms to victims, and that organizations have an obligation under privacy law to prevent and remedy this. This case is also relevant to the discussions that will be taking place on Bill C-63, and I will welcome the opportunity to share my views on the Online Harms Act with parliamentarians. J'ai également hâte de diffuser au cours des
I also look forward to sharing in the coming months the findings of two high-profile investigations that are closely tied to two of my strategic priorities, protecting children's privacy and addressing the privacy impacts of emerging technology, including AI. When I appeared before you last year on Main Estimates, I spoke about the launch of investigations into TikTok, as well as OpenAI, the company behind the AI-driven text generation chatbot ChatGPT. Both investigations are being conducted jointly with my counterparts in Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta.
Investigation, the four offices are examining whether the practices of the company, ByteDance, comply with Canadian federal and provincial privacy legislation, and in particular, whether valid and meaningful consent is being obtained for the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. Given the importance of protecting children's privacy, the joint investigation has a particular focus on TikTok's privacy practices as they relate to younger users. Investigation to OpenAI and its ChatGPT chatbot is examining whether the company is compliant with requirements under Canadian privacy law in relation to consent, openness, access, accuracy, and accountability, and is considering whether the collection, use, and disclosure is done for an appropriate purpose. Les deux enquêtes sont d'une grande priorité.
Both investigations remain a high priority, and we are working to complete them in a timely manner. Protecting and promoting privacy with maximum impact remains integral to fulfilling my current mandate and preparing for potential changes to federal privacy law.
2023 budget, we received temporary funding to address pressures related to privacy breaches and a complaint backlog, as well as to prepare for implementation of Bill C-27. While these temporary funds provided necessary and immediate support, it is essential for my office to be properly resourced on a permanent basis to deal with the increasing complexity of today's privacy landscape and associated demands on my office's resources. And so
There's
we will
a claim here.
Matt, your mic's open there. Sorry, Mr. Dufresne.
No worries. To address this, we will continue to present fiscally responsible funding requests, and will also aim to maximize agility and cost effectiveness by assessing and streamlining programs and service delivery. And with that, I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dufresne. We're going to start with our first 6-minute rounds. Mr. Barrett's going to kick it off. Go ahead, Mr. Barrett.
Thanks for joining us this morning. Mr. Dufresne, on March the 7th, I wrote you a letter asking you to undertake another investigation into the government's ArriveCan app. So in light of the new information related to the handling and security of Canadians' data, can you provide the committee with an update to your ongoing investigation into ArriveCan?
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Indeed, following your letter on March 19th, I announced that I will be investigating allegations of privacy concerns following a complaint against the Canada Border Services Agency related to the development of the ArriveCan mobile app. The investigation will examine contracting practices related to ArriveCan and more specifically the measures that were in place to protect personal information during the development of the app, to assess compliance with the Privacy Act, which applies to federal departments and agencies. And so the investigation is ongoing. Under the Privacy Act, I have to maintain confidential the details of that investigation while it is ongoing, but certainly look forward to completing it and to making the findings public once that is done.
Understanding that the Privacy Commissioner has obligations to respect privacy, I will ask you a series of questions, and if you're able to provide us with an update or further information, I'd appreciate it. But first of all, do you have an expected date of completion when we'd be able to see your findings?
I do not. We work to complete them in as timely a manner as possible, but of course we seek answers and submissions and we consider them, but we will be working to complete this as quickly as we can.
Have you been able to obtain all of the documents necessary from the government and contractors that you've sought?
I don't have concerns to raise on that front. There are powers under the Act that would allow me to obtain information if I needed it.
Are you investigating a potential breach of Section 7 of the Privacy Act, which states that personal information under the control of government institution shall not, without the consent of the individual to whom it relates, be used by the institution except for the purpose for which the information was obtained?
We are examining the contracting practices. We're examining the measures in place to protect the personal information during the development of that app, and we're going to be assessing the compliance with the Privacy Act provisions. And if we see concerns there, we're going to raise those and flag those.
So not able to say specifically which sections of the Act, like whether or not Section 8 of the Privacy Act, which states personal information under the control of a government institution shall not, without the consent of the individual for whom it relates, be disclosed by the institution except in accordance with its section. So Section 7, Section 8, you can't specify which.
My announcement of that investigation has not restricted specific provisions of the Act or otherwise. We said we are looking for compliance with Privacy Act, and if we identify concerns there, we'll raise them.
The Auditor General's report on ArriveCan made it clear that the record keeping done by the government was really so poor that the Auditor General wasn't able to precisely attribute a cost to ArriveCan, saying that she thought it was she thought that it was $60 million. Are you finding that to be the case in your efforts? Well,
these would be some of the comments and observation that we would make in the final report of our investigation, as was done by the AG in hers. So this is not something that I would be commenting on at this stage. It would be once the investigation is over.
So I'm interested to know whether or not you've interviewed government officials and contractors and people whose security clearance was unable to be accounted for. So if you can speak to that, I'd appreciate it. But can you take us through what an interview would look like from your office, irrespective of whom you're interviewing?
Well, in our investigation process, we will identify with the departments the issues that we're looking into. We're going to ask them questions. We're going to ask them for documentations, and we're going to look to see if their practices are compliant with the elements in terms of the use, the collection, the disclosure, the safeguards. And as it moves forward, we may have additional questions. We may follow up on that. We prepare a draft report of finding. We share with them. We give them the opportunity to comment. So this will be underway, but these are not elements of information that I would be making public until the investigation has been concluded.
So with an app like ArriveCan that was mandatory for use for travelers, and for some people, travel is required for their employment, to access medical services, but also just as part of their rights as Canadians to travel freely. The use of the app was mandatory, and the collection of data was mandatory. They had to surrender their personal information. What would the consequences be should you find that CBSA or that the government broke the law, broke the Privacy Act?
Right. Well, one of the areas in the Privacy Act that I would hope to see changed in future modernization of the Act is that I do not currently have the ability to make orders. Binding legal orders vis-a-vis a department of the government. So I would make recommendations. I would identify if there are shortcomings. I would identify and make recommendations. So that's what my report would do, assuming that there is a violation.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Dufresne. Mr. Fisher, 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks, gentlemen, for being here today. I'm interested in, you talked about emerging technologies. Can you maybe highlight what new initiatives and priorities you would be doing, as part of a strategic plan that would grow Canadians' privacy with regards to these emerging technologies in the increasingly digital landscape?
So we're doing a lot of things. We issued, we're working very closely with our provincial and territorial partners. This is one of the very elements I'm very proud of in terms of the close collaboration. So we've issued, for instance, a joint resolution on responsible use of AI, setting out our expectations in terms of privacy practices vis-a-vis AI. We've done that with respect to children's privacy, highlighting things like technologies should not be used to nudge children and minors to make privacy harmful decisions. So we're looking at all of those aspects, particular focus on AI, but we're looking as well about how we can use technology ourselves within the OPC to be more efficient. So we've launched an online portal for privacy impact assessment submissions to make that more seamless. We have developed a tool to assess whether certain privacy breaches would give rise to a real risk of significant harm. So again, not to replace the human decision-making, but to provide assistance on that. So we're really looking to see, we don't see technology as something that's prevented by privacy. You can have and you must have innovation and public interest and economic success alongside privacy. So we're really looking at that. Of course, there are always risks with the use of data in powering innovation. And so this is why I've said we do use data to support innovation, but we have to use innovation to protect personal information.
So, first of all, I'm curious as to how Canadians would find out about this, but what can Canadians do proactively on their own to protect themselves? If they're, using these tools that you're talking about is great, but let's assume that we're just trying to help Canadians proactively take care of their own privacy.
We issue a lot of documents in terms of guidance and statement on issues. For instance, with a number of international colleagues in the privacy community around the world, we issued a statement on data scraping, calling on social media companies to take rigorous measures to protect the information on their social media platform, to protect against data scraping, to protect against privacy breaches. Part of that document, we also gave advice to citizens and to Canadians and saying, here's what you could do to protect your own. Don't check your privacy settings on your apps. Make sure that you're aware who you're giving permission to. When you're sharing pictures of your kids, the notion of sharenting, be mindful of the implications. But it's important to reiterate that the primary obligation shouldn't be on individuals to protect themselves. Organizations and departments and laws have to be there, because that's one of the concerns. If we delegate this too much to individuals, they need to feel that there is a system and that those organizations with the tools to do it are taking the responsibility seriously.
I assume you go to school on our allies and what they do in their respective offices. Who's doing really, really well? What types of things are they doing, and are you following the good examples?
Well, we're working very closely with a number of our international counterparts. I'll name a few. The G7 data protection authorities works yearly. Last year in Japan, we issued a joint statement on artificial intelligence from a privacy standpoint. I was very proud of that statement. It's a statement that was endorsed in the Department of Industry, Minister Champagne's statement on voluntary codes for AI. So that collaboration, the sense that my colleagues and I understand the need to have very strong privacy protection, but at the same time, very strong economies, very strong ability for organizations to have data across borders. I'll point the UK commissioner, the ICO commissioner. They've done great work on children's privacy. They have a children's code, age-appropriate code, talking about steps that we can take. And I think that this is something that C27 highlights. I was happy to see a recent amendment in due committee recognizing the best interest of the child, which was one of my recommended amendments for this bill. And so I think we're seeing lots of work in this space and lots of awareness to perhaps another example I'll give is the creation of privacy, what we call privacy sandbox, where a commissioner's office will invite industry to come and then test a new process and highlight risks and privacy before this technology is deployed so that the risk could be mitigated, and then you protect privacy and you avoid a complaint on the front end.
Do you get a sense that there are any social media platforms that are better than others at respecting the privacy of Canadians, or are they trying to perhaps look for ways to undermine?
Well, we have ongoing complaints and litigation with some of those social media platforms. So there are clearly some issues that we're looking into. We're in litigation following a complaint decision on Facebook. We have a matter vis-a-vis Google in terms of questions on de-indexing of information. We're looking into our investigation of TikTok. But what I'll say is these social media platforms are attending and participating in terms of the global privacy discussions and meetings, and they are providing their input. They are listening to the comments and the input of the community. But I will continue to reiterate to them through both our promotion and our persuasion tools, but also the compliance tools where necessary.
Do you? Unfortunately, that's your time, Mr. Fisher. Monsieur Villemure, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît. Commencez.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you here. I have a few questions that I'll set out from the outset before we get into the heart of the matter. There's someone in Trois-Rivières who's really quite concerned by privacy, and he asked me a question for which I had no answer. So I said I would ask you to get your opinion. They said, if I go on a website, you can continue without accepting and keep going. But if I refuse, the fact that I even went to a website, personal information, the issue of localization and actually clicking on website, that provides information on people's interests. And that's why we are concerned by these matters. You know, navigation, cookies, the use of this information to create profiles of people. And that is an aspect that is relevant in protecting information. That is why the concern about consenting to cookies and other things, that is an issue because it allows people to have access to our privacy information. If the person had said, I say no and I leave, is that information still collected? The idea is that it will restrict the use of certain things. Some uses are inevitable, but other information, for instance, can we consent to using this for targeted ads? For instance, one of my concerns in this regard is that often these choices are not choices that are easy to make. The easy choice is to just accept everything, accept all, but refuse all. I would like to see a much more accessible option. Often you have to click on a few things or go a bit further. People ask some detail. The site will ask you for detail. So yes, I think there is work to be done. When you look at when you look at how many partners, etc., you'd have to click 127 times. Listen, if I had to speak to this gentleman, I say he's gone on the site. He did not collect. He did not decide to go any further. He rejected. There's no further information. No, there's no further information collected. But our issue here is the fact that sometimes you don't always know what you're consenting to, or it will prevent you from having access to a service that you otherwise would like to use. This is part of our thought process, and through AI, the capacity for algorithms there is just growing. They're even more able to detect things with less information. There needs to be additional vigilance. So the notion of freedom and choice is called into question. I have another question. My colleague was talking about platforms that do uphold privacy issues. But if you look at the major platforms, which ones are, can we say, rogue? You know, there are a number of people around me that use a whole bunch of things that I've never heard about. Could you say that there are some we should be more vigilant about than others? We recently, we haven't made it public yet, but we've done a review, what we call a data sweep. So what we do is we check with international partners a number of websites on a random basis, and then we look at whether on these websites there may be ways of communicating in a malicious way that will make people renounce some of their privacy rights. And we did it along with our colleagues in the competition field. And that's coming. We don't have the results yet, but that'll give us an opportunity to say, okay, we have some concerns about some of the sites. To date, we have commented on practices that we don't want to see happen, and some targeted issues where a particular organization will be named, then we'll do that. We'll have a complaint process for that, and we have complaints underway. But I'd like to see more sites where there would be privacy by default, by design. I don't like the fact that, as you said, it's easy to accept everything, but not to refuse everything. When they say continue without accepting, is there still information that is collected or nothing at all? The parameters can be set by default. Some are by default that you're agreeing to. And in order to go any further, you have to agree to all. And that's something we're looking at. Our colleagues from the UK have really focused on this. Agree to all. Does that require a legislative change, or is it more a regulatory issue? I think that in C27, there's a lot of focus on the fact that consent has to be something that is easy to understand. It needs to be simpler. There need to be more proactive obligations for these organizations. There will be additional duties from my office to provide some orientation and orders as well. I think it's a step in the right direction. Do you think an order would be upheld? Or is it like the Ethics Commissioner where the orders are issued, but, well, I'll presume that until proof of the contrary, I will assume that an organization will respect the law. Otherwise, there is recourse before the courts, and that's why it's important to have the power to make orders. Most of these organizations in Canada certainly want or are concerned about their reputation, concerned about their clients, will do the right thing, and will comply to a recommendation. That was the case in the Home Depot file. We made a recommendation, and they kept to it. And that was the right thing to do. The option to have orders and also penalties, financial penalties, is important to have this, not because I want to use them, but it motivates people to make good decisions and prioritize privacy. Whereas if we don't have that, then those decision makers might prioritize other areas where there are financial penalties. Thank you.
Mr. Dufresne.
Thank you, Mr. Dufresne. Mr. Dumur.
Let's go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I have adequately taken control of my mute button, so I do appreciate that and apologize for earlier disruption. Mr. Dufresne, I always appreciate you appearing before this committee. In so many ways, your work guides the work that we do, not just in the committee, but as parliamentarians. And so I'd like to reference your 2024-2025 departmental plan, where you have survey results on the protection of privacy rights, which I find very concerning. In the 2022-2023 survey, only 39% of respondents felt that businesses respect their privacy rights. That's down 45% in 2020 to 2021. Only 58% of respondents feel that the federal government respects their privacy rights. Again, down from 63% in 2022-2023. Both of these results fall well short of your target goal of 90%. Can you explain why these numbers are so low and what can be done to reverse this downward trend?
Well, I think that those numbers are low. I think this is one of the reasons we've highlighted technology and children in our strategic priorities. I think that there is a sense that technology is more and more intrusive. It's relying more and more on data and on personal information to fuel tools and innovation. And so some of the discussions that we've been having here today in terms of consent to use websites, in terms of what can people do with to protect their personal information, I think Canadians feel that they are bombarded by requests for their personal information. And so it's important that the institutions and the systems provide recourses and provide that proactive discipline in organizations to not only protect privacy, but be seen to protect privacy. So I think we are seeing these types of concerns. We are seeing that Canadians want to see more rigorous legal protections about their privacy rights. And this is why we're advocating for a modernized legislation where I would have order-making powers. There would be the possibility of fines. There would be the possibility of real consequences if privacy is not respected. And I think we also need to see more proactive privacy protections that are done at the front end. That's why I've been calling for privacy impact assessments to be a legal obligation, both for departments and for private sector organizations. And so I think that there's work to be done. I think it shows that the Canadians care about their privacy and that collectively we need to be mindful of this so that Canadians do not feel, as they seem to now, to feel that it can be a trade-off between your personal information and innovation.
And on the topic, so those are some very important points that you've raised. Certainly, when you talk about the impact, the privacy impact assessments, we at this committee dealt with what I consider to be the complete disregard of the mandate of the Treasury Board to provide those. Some departments just completely disregarding privacy impact assessments and only doing it, in fact, after they were caught. But you raised the issue, I think, which is quite important about safeguarding our youth in this regard. And of course, I'm sure you would perhaps agree that the youth today are not going to websites. They're using platforms, social media platforms. You referenced, I think, an assessment around TikTok. Without getting into the details or preempting the release of your report, can you just provide us a high-level assessment of the ways in which platforms profile, use algorithms to target people based on their interests and why that would be a problem?
Well, we're focused in some of these investigations, we're focused on the consent. So are you obtaining meaningful consent by Canadians, and are you doing that in an appropriate way with respect to the age? So we have guidance on that in terms of what is appropriate for an adult isn't going to be appropriate for a child, for a minor. So there are different types of circumstances, and C27 recognizes that by protecting minors' information and treating it as sensitive. So that's a positive step and an additional positive step to recognize the best interest of the child.
A more pointed question, in your opinion, based on your preliminary work on this, do you find some platforms worse than others? For instance, TikTok is constantly brought up, and we're hearing lots of information about that. But how would they compare to, say, an Instagram or X, formerly known as Twitter or Facebook?
Well, what we look for in terms of investigations and reviews is an organization putting commensurate measures to protect the sensitivity of the information of minors and children? Are they aware of the likelihood of their users? So we're investigating TikTok, and we announced that we were going to be focusing particularly on children's use, because this is a big part of the clientele of that website.
Is that because you don't think Instagram and Facebook and X do the same, or that they do it in different ways? Help me understand that.
Well, we're investigating TikTok right now, so this is the one where we will have some findings to make. We have made a general statement about, for all social medias, in terms of protecting the rights of children. With my provincial territorial counterparts, we cautioned against nudging techniques that would encourage children to give more personal information than they need to. We've called for a treatment of children's personal information to be different, to have a greater right to delete information. So I won't make a specific comment about a specific website if we haven't investigated it particularly on that issue, but generally we are calling on all of those platforms to be mindful of those elements. And again, I think C27 will bring greater tools in this respect with this heightened protection. And I've made it one of my priorities, so we're going to continue the education work, but also targeted compliance as needed to protect children whichever platform would be at issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Dufresne. Mr. Kirk, I have you up. We're going to start our second rounds for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks, thanks, Commissioner. I'm curious, Commissioner, are you aware of the privilege debate that took place in Parliament last night and this morning regarding 18 members of a parliamentary association that with an attempted hack of personal information?
I am not. No, I haven't been briefed on that yet, unfortunately.
Okay, so it's a very quickly developing situation, but we learned only a couple of months ago, because of an unsealed report from the Department of Justice compiled by the FBI in the United States, that in January of 2021 there was an attempt by a hostile foreign state actor connected with the communist dictatorship in Beijing that had attempted to infiltrate 18 parliamentarians' personal email accounts. I'm wondering, and I know you haven't had a chance to get into the debate that took place in Parliament, and I was hopeful, and certainly I've been at committee here, so we haven't been called to a vote. So I think that that's a good sign that it passed unanimously to send that to Proc. But I'm wondering if you could maybe share some thoughts with this committee about how important that is, and if I could encourage you, not just when it comes to the protection of private information, when it comes to MPs being able to do their jobs, because obviously that's one part of it. But what I brought up in my speech last night was how important it is to ensure that Canadians feel protected and that appropriate responses are brought forward when there's attempts to use private information for nefarious purposes, whether that be diaspora communities that may be at odds with a government that they have a connection to. I'm wondering if you could provide any comments on that and share some thoughts with this committee.
Sure. Well, what this highlights, and I've issued a declaration last December with the UN Special Rapporteur on privacy and human rights, and I highlighted the link between the protection of privacy and other fundamental rights, and that includes democratic rights. And so protecting privacy, whether it's the privacy of members of Parliament, whether it's the privacy of voters and citizens, we can see that there overlaps with other sector. That's why it's so important to protect privacy for its own sake, but also because it supports and promotes other fundamental rights. And so that's an issue that's raised in this instance. I will certainly be interested to see where the parliamentary privilege question is a question for the House, of course, but certainly will be mindful and being briefed on it. There is proposed modification to the Elections Act vis-a-vis privacy obligations for political parties. So that's another example where you have some intersectionality with my office has a role to play, but there are other regulators, Canada Elections CEO. And so this is an area where I work very closely with other regulators where there are areas of overlap. And so we'll be following up.
So is informing, whether it's parliamentarians in this case or whether it be informing the public. I know it was interesting as the debate was taking place last night. Premier Eby out of British Columbia had announced, and I happened to see the statement on Twitter, and of course it provided a link to a government of BC website. But is informing those affected and generally the public of what's going on a part of that process of making sure that privacy can be safeguarded?
If we're talking about privacy breaches generally in the private sector or public sector, one of the elements is that the organization would have to notify my office and would have to notify the affected individuals as early as possible. So that's part of the mechanisms to provide that information, and then mechanisms to take steps to protect and prevent and address it. So we have complaints underway with respect to privacy breaches, for instance, with the government's Geolocation Services, BGIS. We've launched an investigation vis-a-vis the Global Affairs privacy breach. So privacy breaches are something that we are concerned about. They're happening more and more, and we have a role to play in that.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner, and certainly I'd value if you have any. I'm basically out of time, but if there's any further feedback that you could provide this committee, and hopefully if you have a chance to send as PROC, hopefully we'll be seized with this in the near future. I'd certainly encourage you to share your feelings and feedback there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Mr. Kirk. We're going to go to Mr. Baines next for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and of course, thank you, Mr. Dufresne, for joining us again today. I'm curious about understanding a little bit more about how big is your team that you're working with? What resources do you have, and is this allowing you to be more proactive in engaging strategic priorities, or where are you at with your office and your team?
Thank you. So we have roughly 215 employees at the OPC, and we have proposed budget funding for my office in 2024-2025, main estimates of $34 million. We have had an increase of $4.5 million in the previous year, attributable half of that to collective bargaining increases. So that's not really increasing our budget or our ability to do our work. It's just maintaining it. And we've had temporary funding as part of budget 2023 of $2.4 million for that year to help us address backlog and privacy breaches. We need increases in our budgets on a permanent basis. This additional funding is useful and very important, but it will come to an end. And the challenges will not come to an end. We are seeing more privacy breaches. We are seeing them on a larger scale. We are seeing them more complex, and technology is making it more challenging. So there's a need for more permanent funding on that. And on specifically the point of more proactive and promotion work, we will also need additional resources in this space, particularly with if C-27 is adopted. C-27 would bring new responsibilities to my office, both from an enforcement standpoint with order-making powers, but also, as importantly, more guidance opportunities to help organizations and small, medium enterprises to know what their obligations are, to provide clarity on this. Industry needs as much certainty as possible to do their work and to know what the expectations are. There are very interesting provisions in C-27 that would allow the preparation of codes of practices and certification program. This is something that businesses around the world have been asking for to give them more certainty. And I would be playing a role in approving them and providing some more legal certainty. So there are lots of things that we could be doing. The resources limits that. Of course, public resources have to be used judiciously and cautiously. So we're looking at that. We've made some requests. We're going to continue to do that in a fiscally prudent manner.
Okay, thank you. So it's clear that your obligations are continuing to change, and your scope is broadening. So more as this technological advances occur, you have to continue to keep growing from there. So I understand that. Can you expand on the sandbox example you gave, and how do you, and maybe even the data sweep? What is the criteria you use?
So in terms of the sandboxes, organizations, we're not currently resourced to offer this, but my international counterparts are, and they are doing it with business. And so they will say, you can come over and you can test this new technology in a safe space where the regulator can provide input, can provide risk. So we're able to provide proactive guidance and to be consulted, and we have services for that, but not to the same extent of Sandbox. This is something I'd like to be able to do. I think it would be good for Canadians, and it would be good for industry. So we've identified that we would need ongoing annual funding increase of about $25 million for C27 to optimally provide those services based on those new authorities. In terms of the sweep that you made reference to with our partners, we look at various numbers of website and see, and I don't have the randomized formula that was used by the team, but the goal is to say we're going to do some spot checks and see are there trends, are there concerns, are we seeing some websites that are using what we call deceptive practices or dark patterns, which are communication tools that will lead people into making bad decisions and will sometimes trick them.
I just want to, just on that piece there, you talked about nudging techniques. Can you give some examples of that? And before I run out of time, I'm curious to also if you can add on, if like, should we be having an educational campaign across Canada, to ensure people know what to avoid, what kind of nudging techniques there are?
So, Mr. Baines, you are out of time, but Mr. Dufresne, if you can answer that question.
Yes,
quickly,
very
please.
quickly. A nudging technique is basically you're making it very easy to make one choice and you're making it very hard to make another choice. So when you're making it very easy to make a bad choice, you're nudging towards that bad choice.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Monsieur Villemure, 2 minutes et demi.
Président, je vais encore profiter de votre présence.
I will continue along in the same vein as my earlier round of questions. When someone told me the other day that when they agreed to the strictly necessary cookies, who determined that it is strictly necessary? Is it the company or is it a standard? That's the opinion of the company, the business. But in the Act, there are obligations that state that businesses should not be collecting further information than what is necessary for their purposes. But the determination is made by that organization. Inaudible? Answer, it could be challenged. Someone could say, well, was it really necessary? And then there are processes in place, including my office's work, to address that. When it comes to privacy, are there any particular concerns? You're referring to what specifically? The apps that allow for inaudible to the interpreter. Answer. That was mentioned in my office. There will be legislative processes to make the banking system more open. In other words, more sharing of information for consumers, but also to fight against money laundering, etc. So you were talking about one-step banking. In one case, it would be regulated by the authorities, the banking authorities. On the other hand, it would be the anti-money laundering authorities. But in both cases, I will be involved. I will be consulted. I expect that. And in the case of money laundering, there is an expectation in the bill that there will be regulations for me to approve codes of practice that will be doing that. So I think these are certainly developments that will foster more developments and encourage people to communicate, to have further banking services, but communicating the importance of privacy first and foremost. And I will raise this issue so that we make sure we don't have innovation to the detriment of privacy. So even despite this innovation, which sounds good, there still be a focus on privacy as a fundamental right. I will continue to ensure with the legislative powers that I have that is the case, and in the context of new bills, I will provide my opinion to the relevant committee if it has to be enhanced, if this process has to be enhanced. But I will certainly be very active in raising these issues, as I've done in other areas, like in the area of cyber security or national security. I've said it many times. This is not a zero-sum game. We don't have to say, oh, you can't have innovation without sacrificing privacy. But it requires work. It requires consultations. And a tangible example of this, last year with my colleagues from the Competition Bureau and the CRTC, we created a forum for regulatory organizations in the digital space to say, we want to work together. We don't want there to be these zero-sum game concepts. And we've just renewed it for a second year. I'll be presiding this forum for the second year, and we'll be looking for deliverables.
Yeah, Mr. Green, 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put two questions relatively quickly to you, sir. You reported that 55% of complaints received by your office are responded to within the service standards, but that is still below your target of 75%. Can you explain what steps you are taking to reach the 75% target?
Right. So we've obtained additional funding, and that's helped. We are looking at our processes. We have done an assessment to see can we find efficiencies? Can we streamline? Can we have some more early resolution of complaints? We're really looking at all of those aspects, and this is the strategic priority number one in my strategic plan, talking about optimizing the OPC
Is the funding
itself.
adequate, sir?
Well, the funding is not adequate. It's not permanent. So we have had temporary funding, and that has helped greatly. But we need permanent funding because those complaints are permanent, and those breaches are permanent, and they are increasing. And so this is something that I hope.
On March 7th, 2023, the Information Commissioner of Canada appeared before our committee, and she had some feedback on the way in which you're funded. On the topic of funding, I strongly believe that a model that gives the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister the power to limit the required funding agents of Parliament is contrary to our oversight role. As agents of Parliament, we report directly to Parliament rather than to a cabinet or a particular ministry. Frankly, the manner in which we're funded should reflect this independence. Do you agree with that statement?
I do. I think as agents of Parliament, we report to you. We don't report to the executive branch. And in fact, we investigate complaints against the executive branch. In my case, there may be a difference vis-a-vis the private sector mandate that I have. I have both public sector and private sector. So maybe less of a concern vis-a-vis the investigation of the private sector, but vis-a-vis the investigation of the public sector, there is that appearance of concern.
Straightforward. Do you have any recommendations on how to make the process by which funding is provided to the officers of Parliament entirely independent of the government?
Well, there was a process in the past where the requests were reviewed by a committee of parliamentarians. I think it was chaired by the Speaker's office, and you had representative of all parties, and then it went forward to Treasury Board. So it wasn't fully independent, but it certainly provided greater oversight, where there's the example of the Parliamentary Budget Officer or Elections Canada. So have less of a approval by the Treasury Board and the Executive and more of an approval by the Speakers or the Houses. So they're tools. I think that the key point is more legislative involvement.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Dufresne, we're going to go 4 and 4. Mr. Brock, followed by Ms. Khalid. We do have some votes we need, so I need to leave a little time for that. Go ahead, Mr. Brock, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for your attendance. Commissioner, my questions will be directed towards you for the 4 minutes that I have. Is it accurate, sir, that apart from my colleague, Mr. Barrett, he is the only parliamentarian to launch a particular complaint and a request for your office to investigate the circumstances behind the Arrive scam issue?
The current complaint. The current complaint was in response to Mr. Barrett's.
Is the only parliamentarian?
My team can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that's the case.
Okay. Have you received anonymous complaints from any other source in relation to the Arrive scam debacle?
I don't have that information, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily information that I would be making public if it has been an anonymous situation. So I'm not sure how to respond to that.
Sure. I'll be more specific. Have you received any complaints, any areas of concern raised by any current or former CBSA officials or employees?
Again, these are not, the Privacy Act provides significant confidentiality obligations on me on that.
Okay, I anticipated that response. I thought I'd ask it though. Following up on a point that I'm not sure I was clear on in terms of or an inability on your part to provide meaningful consequences should there be a violation of your act. Did I get that correct?
You did. I do not currently have the ability to issue binding orders under the Privacy Act.
Okay. What about monetary penalties?
Same. There's no monetary penalties.
Okay. And this has been an issue since the act was amended and created. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that's a concern both on the private sector side and on the public sector side.
And you've made several recommendations along those lines in your current role, and I'm sure your predecessors have probably voiced very similar concerns to committee members, and literally since 2015 there has been no appetite by the Justin Trudeau government to provide any meaningful consequences to these violations. Is that correct?
Well, Bill C-27 was introduced by the government, and it would provide me with the ability to issue orders, and it would provide for the ability for fines to be issued. That's on the private sector side. In terms of the public sector, there's no bill to modernize it. Currently, the Department of Justice has done a consultation paper where that was a recommendation in terms of greater compliance mechanism, and I certainly encourage that from moving forward.
Sure. And when was that recommendation made by the DOJ?
The recommendation was made in 2021, and then since they've been consulting to get, in particular, more of an Indigenous perspective on this. My office, under my predecessor, supported this, of course, and as do I.
Okay. Quickly, one quick question on the Arrive scam issue. There is allegations, very strong allegations, that a vice president of the CBSA by the name of Min Doan had intentionally deleted 4 years' worth of relevant emails. Emails that would have been very helpful to the Auditor General when she conducted her review. Emails that would have been helpful for the internal investigator who is still investigating the actions of several players. Do you think this would have been helpful for you as well if you had access to that? And if so, sir, what do you say in terms of your position as a commissioner in relation to those allegations?
Very, very quick response, please.
Well, if I were to make any comments on that, it would be at the conclusion of an investigation if we had seen concerns. So it's not something that I would comment on at this stage.
Ms. Khalid, for 4 minutes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Really appreciate always your input. Just want to pick up on a point raised by my colleague, Mr. Green, with respect to balance of powers and something that you had said as well. Is it possible for there to be a complete separation between what your office does and what the government and the interaction between the two?
Well, we work very closely. Agents of Parliament, it's not a perfect, complete separation. We're proposed by the executive branch, but we're approved by the houses. So there is certainly independence, but we're working as part of the public service, and we are applying a number of the procedures. And we also have to work very closely with the Treasury Board, which is providing guidance on Privacy Act compliance. And my approach is, you've heard me recommend for strong compliance powers, and I believe this is necessary. But I'm also a firm believer in collaboration and prevention. So I do work very closely with the departments to inform them of privacy and encourage them to raise issues in advance so that we can prevent them.
So just expanding on that, then, how do you work with stakeholders to navigate through the changing needs of what privacy concerns Canadians have right now?
Well, we do a lot of outreach with all sectors, so civil society, I've had a very interesting discussion with children, youth parliamentarians, very interested about their challenge and how they see privacy issues and how they interact with their schools. And I want to see privacy as part of a mandatory curriculum. It's not exclusive, certainly not exclusive federal jurisdiction. I'm going to work with my provincial colleagues on that. Work very closely with industry. I receive complaints about industry, of course, but it's important for me to understand what are their realities. We want laws and rules that make sense, protect Canadians' fundamental right to privacy, but also has to work for industry. I want Canada to be competitive and innovative. I've said my three priorities, my vision for privacy is a fundamental right, but privacy supporting innovation and supporting the public interest and generating trust. So it's important that I understand those realities, and it's important that they understand my preoccupation. So it's a very helpful dialogue where they will say, here are the challenges we face on the ground, and I will say to them, here's what I'm hearing from Canadians where they feel that their privacy is not being protected. And so that dialogue continues, and then if issues are not resolved, there are ways through compliance. But even through compliance, I think in some cases, we may find that there is a violation, make a recommendation, the organization learns it, they speak to their counterparts, and then they implement the good practice.
So I know that there's been conversations about digital ID as part of trying to circumvent a lot of these issues that you've talked about. What is your viewpoint on that? Do you think that that is something necessary, and how does that work with our privacy laws?
Well, this is an example where I've had strong collaboration with my provincial territorial counterparts in the Privacy Commission, and in October, not this October, but the year before, we actually issued a joint statement on digital ID from a privacy perspective. And so we flagged that this is something that can make it easier for Canadians to interact with their government and so on. But it has to be done, if it is to be done, in a privacy protective manner. And we gave a number of advice on that. It should preserve anonymity. It should not be a central repository and so on. So there's a number of comments. We didn't say you can't have it. We said this is something that could certainly be useful. Make sure you do it in a privacy protective way, and we gave some clear advice on how to do that.
And would a digital ID in the hands of a private company pose significant risks to Canadians?
Well, all aspects of obtaining digital identification or biometric information about anyone, whether from the public sector or private sector, is an area that people have to be mindful of. We currently have draft guidance on use of biometric information, one for private sector, one for public sector. We've received good feedback from industry and from Canadians on that. We're working to finalize that. So certainly any type of innovation, digital or otherwise, it brings a lot of benefits, or it can. We need to make sure it's not done at the expense of privacy, and there are ways of doing it.
Thank you, Ms. Khalid. Thank you, Mr. Dufresne. Mr. Dufresne, I do appreciate you being here on behalf of the committee today. Thank you for the work that you're doing, the important work that you're doing on behalf of Canadians. Mr. Ruth, thank you for being here in support as well. So I'm going to move to the main estimates right now. I'm going to ask the committee whether we have unanimous consent to adopt all votes on the main estimates 2024-2025 referred to the committee in one vote. Do we have consent to do that? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Green. Monsieur Villemure. Shall vote 1 under the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying, vote 1 under the Office of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, vote 1 under the Office of the Senate Ethics Officer, votes 1 and 5 under Offices of the Information and Privacy Commissioners of Canada carry? On division. On division? Thank you. Shall I report the main estimates 2024-2025 to the House? On division. Okay, thank you. We're going to suspend for a few minutes while we set up the next panel. So the meeting is suspended. Thank you again, Mr. Dufresne.